Welcome back to part two. In the previous section, we discussed a little bit about China as a rising trade power. Um, Specifically important is the fact that China, since the 1970s, became what's called an export-led industrialization country. So the China's industrialization was very much based on its exports and its engagement with the global market economy due to the fact that a large population was able to produce items very cheaply for the world market. And because it's a centralized state-led economy, they were able to use the profits from such endeavors and build massive infrastructural projects, et cetera, and build the economy and develop through this form of export-led industrialization. Now we're moving on to India, which has is quite different from China's development. That being said, you know, we discussed how China has seen such a dramatic rise in economic and geopolitical power in recent decades. A close second to this development is actually India, though. India could be the second largest economy by 2030, replacing even the United States. Uh, it could also soon become the world's largest population, as it's growing much faster than China, which we discussed before is facing a severe population crisis due to the one-child policy and just the fact that the numbers are dwindling and demographics are dwindling more in China. So India actually has a rapidly rising young population. Um, Urbanization could also double from where it was in India. So it could be double from what it was in 2008 to what it'll be in 2040. And that's the idea that urbanization within India could actually double within this amount of time, which is also extraordinary, only 32 years. In a span of 32 years, it can double. So in recent years, India has also moved into a trade deficit. This means that it buys more goods from the world market than what it produces. Rather than being a sign of weakness or a bad thing, like many populists such as Trump in the United States believes, this is also actually a sign that India does have growing wealth and is able to buy goods from elsewhere to meet the needs of its population. So this means that more goods are coming into India than India is currently selling on the world market. And depending on who you talk to, this can be a sign of strength or weakness. But we can acknowledge that it is in some ways a sign of strength that India is becoming more wealthier and able to purchase more on the world market. Uh, India does, however, face some challenges. Most importantly, due to the fact that it's located within a very difficult geopolitical environment. It's bordering two very powerful nuclear rivals, namely Pakistan and China. And the history of relations between India and in these two states is one of persistent tension or conflict. More recently, even in 2020, we see skirmishes between China and India along the border. And obviously, some areas remain quite um, tense also in the region of Kashmir, et cetera. And the relations between um, Pakistan and India are always quite tense. Um, India's geography and these kind of international tensions and conflicts makes it really difficult for India to carve out a role in the region and exert political authority beyond its borders. That being said, it is a rising military power. Due to its large population, it's able to use this manpower and resources to enhance its military capabilities. So it has been a stronger military power in recent years. And moreover, the current government under Modi has moved towards a more aggressive form of nationalism and has also tried to assert a larger role for itself, for India within the world system or within world order, as it's sometimes described. Despite India's trade deficit, which we mentioned before, it is still a crucial node in the global supply chain. This is obvious when we look at the disruptions caused by the pandemic. Textiles were one very important aspect of this. When supply chains are disrupted in India, the ramification, because India's economy is so large, the ramifications are global, right? And this is just more evidence that we're in such a globalized world economy, right? Where something that's happening as far away from India can have ramifications all around the world. So India is still a key important part of our global supply chains. India continues to face some serious challenges. Namely, it's extremely high levels of poverty. Despite its growth, this growth in India has been largely uneven. This means that some parts are being very developed very rapidly, and some parts are still rapidly underdeveloped. You see this in major cities and major urban centers such as Mumbai, where you even within the city limits, you see slums that are or high rises and condos and very wealthy areas, very close to slums and extreme poverty. So you can see that it's not always an even development. It's rather been quite uneven in India. Unlike China, there is a declining middle class in India. So there's both growing numbers of rich people as well as growing numbers of those experiencing poverty or being very quite poor. So this is a troubling disequilibrium historically, which produces forms of political instability. You can see, a sign of strength in a country is the expansion and growth of a strong middle class, and we don't see that happening in India right now. India and other developing countries have come under scrutiny from various developed, wealthy nation states for its poor adherence or regard for climate change and pollution. While these concerns are valid in many senses, the countries like China and India do produce lots of pollution. The truth is that there was also very little regard amongst Western powers when it was developing. So it's a little bit hypocritical for Western states such as Canada, the United States, the United Kingdom, the EU in its entirety, et cetera, to criticize carbon-intensive forms of development in places like India, when such methods were what allowed the West to industrialize. So this has been mentioned various times by Chinese and Indian economists too, where when they're coming under scrutiny for these environmental concerns, it is a little interesting how it's quite convenient that that these concerns are levied now rather than acknowledging the fact that such methods were also what led to the West's development. So in the West, not too long ago, in countries like the United Kingdom, the United States, et cetera, there were massive environmental concerns due to pollution and emissions. There still are to a certain degree, but there were massive issues with pollution and emissions. There were things like acid rain, huge amounts of smog over cities, including Toronto, where and people were driving things like lead cars, and so it got to the point where the West was wealthy. So when the West became wealthy was only when the West chose cleaner energy for its industry and manufacturing. So demanding this of poor nations is then often controversial, right? But that being said, India and China, due to their size and population, the environmental concerns are quite relevant, and they are going to pose a significant challenge in future years, both within these countries as well as within the global biosphere itself. So it's both a political issue and an environmental issue fused into one, and because of that, when you take into account history and all these things, it is a source of conflict. Um, India is also extremely large and diverse. So social cohesion is also extremely difficult to maintain. Many states suffer with issues with political and social cohesion, but India, with the various cultural and ethnic groups, this has kind of spilled over also into political struggles between regions and groups, and this causes a significant challenge for its development, right? When you have such a mosaic of different diverse identities and groups within one country, sometimes this spills over into political conflict as well. And we can see that in specific regions of India as well as posing quite a challenge. Moving on to Indonesia, perhaps a less obvious choice than India and China, but Indonesia is predicted to be the fourth largest economy by 2045. Jakarta, the capital of Indonesia, could be the largest megacity. Based on its growth, it's predicted that it'll be much larger than even Tokyo, or other large mega cities within China, et cetera. Indonesia is relatively an untapped trade market with an enormous population. So there's lots of room for growth and development. However, they are a long way from reaching this potential. Indonesia was hit very hard by COVID and the various crises that were produced by COVID, and this has kind of hurt Indonesia's economic development in recent years. It also, much like India, suffers from severe social cohesion problems due to the various political and cultural divisions across the country. They have a significant problem as well with terrorism. They even have areas which have seceded from Indonesia, the Indonesian state, namely East Timor. It is also heavily dependent or reliant on China, which kind of makes it difficult when you're so reliant on another great power to reach the status of a great power. The fact is that Indonesia is also geographically, if you look at the geography, made up of very many islands. So this means that in future years, they'll need much more infrastructure and development in order to connect the various islands and to reach its full, in order for it to reach its full potential as an economic superpower, right? However, there is some expectations that it could be what's called a sleeping giant in world order. That is, if it's able to overcome these challenges that it faces, it could be on the same trajectory as other great powers and could actually be a major superpower in the 21st century. So there's a lot of potential for Indonesia as well as issues, but some have predicted that Indonesia could be one of these states that really catches us by surprise. Moving on to Egypt, leaving Asia and going on to Africa. I could have picked many different countries in Africa. I was kind of struggling over this, whether to choose South Africa or Nigeria, which are also powerhouses within Africa. But many economists predict that Egypt actually has the best chance of becoming a major economic power within Africa. This is again due to its enormous population of about 102 million people. It also has very close and easy access to European and African markets. It's on the Mediterranean, it's near the Middle East, Africa, Europe. And so it has access to all these various markets. If you look at where Egypt's located on a map, you can see why this could be such a crucial node within the global economy. It also has the advantage of controlling the Suez Canal. And we can see how important this trade artery is when we see last year when a giant cargo ship got stuck in the Suez and halted global trade through there. It had impacts on the entire global economy. So the Suez Canal is a key part of international trade and allows you to get from Asia through the Mediterranean and into European markets without having to go all the way around Africa, right? So control over the Suez Canal matters very much, and it's a key part of their geopolitical power. We also see massive urbanization, specifically around major cities in Egypt, namely Cairo. In recent years, Egypt has recognized some of the issues of having its largest city and its political capital both located in Cairo. So they are designing a new capital in order to have both a political capital and an economic capital. So they don't. The idea is that if you have your political capital in the same city as your largest city, it can kind of lead to some issues. That's part of the reason also why Brazil moved its, has a capital in the almost pretty much in the middle of the rainforest, and Brasilia separate from Rio de Janeiro, for example, right? Or Sao Paulo. Egypt also does have major issues with its political stability. It's had various dictators and various corrupt governments, as well as uprisings. The Arab Spring would be the one that comes to mind also. So it's not always politically cohesive, and it needs to kind of resolve persistent political issues if it's going to be an attractive site for investment and global business in future years. Egypt is not always the most stable, it doesn't have necessarily the most stable governments at all times, and it's often kind of teetered into dictatorships or uprisings in response to the dictatorships in previous decades. So it hasn't always been a model example of political stability domestically. But that's not its only problem. Its only problem isn't only domestic. It also has geopolitical issues in its neighborhood, right? It's near Iran, Iraq, Syria, Libya, Israel, and other states that have significant stability and security concerns in recent years, right? Um, so if there was, for instance, a spillover in any conflict in any of the states surrounding Egypt, it could easily spill over and impact Egypt and its security. A good example of this is the Gaza Strip, which shares a border with Egypt as well as Israel. If there's conflict in the Gaza Strip, for example, this can kind of have impacts on Egypt's security as well. If there's a conflict in Libya, this can have impacts on Egypt's security. So these are all things that are constant issues that Egypt has to struggle with as well. So it needs, in order to maintain that, to remain a consistent economic superpower and attract investment and trade and development, it kind of has to resolve some of these political issues as well. And hopefully in future years, we have a more stable geopolitical environment in the Middle East that can kind of help states like Egypt reach their full potential, especially when there's so much, there's so many positive things that could happen for Egypt due to its location and all such things, but there are all these other issues that are kind of pulling Egypt back. Okay, moving on to Brazil. So we need to talk about to go to South America now because it's again a major node in the world economy, and we need to talk about Brazil, which is the largest economy in South America. It's already a major trading power in the region. It has the fastest growing population and urbanization in the development of its major megacities. We see income levels in Brazil rise across the board. However, there is still an enormous gap between rich and poor. We see this in urbanized centers where $1 million properties are again just miles away from some of the worst slums in the world. If you look at Sao Paulo or Rio de Janeiro, you see that this unbelievable amount of wealth and then just horrific forms of poverty. The development of Brazil has not led to a growth, again, of a large middle class. And because of this, there's a stark divide between rich and poor, which we've discussed previous weeks, and with rises of things like populism, authoritarianism, et cetera, that when you have such divides, it can often lead to instability, right? Because you have this situation where some certain segments of the population and citizenry are benefiting from global business, global trade, global development, and other section or just overall processes of globalization, whereas other sections of society are obviously not benefiting, at least definitely not in comparable ways, right? And you have things that are sometimes called systemic poverty or poverty that's reproduced generationally. And it's very difficult for those within the lower tiers or classes of society to elevate themselves above and enter the middle class or the upper middle class, et cetera, right? There's also poor infrastructure in Brazil with long distances between different cities and neighborhoods, et cetera, with very little infrastructure to support travel and trading routes, et cetera. So that also, this lack of infrastructure in Brazil is also something that's really holding back its overall development. Brazil, however, does have excellent access to both North American and South American markets. That being said, Brazil has faced some serious challenges, especially in the era of COVID-19. The leadership of Jair Bolsonaro, who, despite catching COVID, has persistently denied its existence and failed to put in place the public health protocols that are necessary to protect Brazilian citizens. And as a result, many Brazilians have died due to COVID-19. There will soon be an election in Brazil, so hopefully this changes things. There's been the Jair Bolsonaro, the current leader, is quite authoritarian and leans very far right. We talked about political ideology and spectrum before in previous weeks, but if you want to look into him, he's quite an interesting character. There has been some some issues with his leadership, both within Brazil and internationally. Um, Brazil, however, it is very resource rich as a country. And when you look at the rainforest and the large territory that Brazil controls, there's lots of untapped land and resources. Um, However, environmental concerns for the globe, including the rainforest, which is sometimes referred to as like the lungs of the earth, um, future economic infrastructural development in environmentally important regions in Brazil remains a controversial issue both domestically and internationally. So there have been a large concern with environmental activists even being killed in the rainforest for trying to defend by loggers, et cetera, people trying to economically develop the rainforest and the resources of the rainforest. There's been conflicts between indigenous communities, et cetera, that are much more concerned with maintaining the environment and the pristine nature of the Brazilian rainforest. So this has been a political issue, which has even spilled over to direct forms of violence. There's also the issue that Brazil needs to really find its place and role within the world economy, as well as world order more generally, and the values in which it seeks to support in global governance. Um, it has all the means to become a great power, but it's just not sure yet what kind of power it wants to be in the 21st century. And that's kind of been a long-term struggle for Brazil. And also it is like many other powerful states. There is dramatic changes from administration to administration as well. And there's also, I should mention, there's also persistent issues with corruption in Brazil, which also hampers its overall development, which you can look into it yourselves, but especially if any of you are interested in Brazil. But yeah, there's systemic issues of corruption as well that have impacted the country. So especially with the imprisoning of Lula da Silva, I'll leave you all to do your own research on Brazil. I just want to give you the spark notes, but yeah, it has had these kind of issues of political corruption as well that are deep and systemic now in the state. To wrap it up, we've discussed today that things are changing quite rapidly in global politics, and there's a variety of new challenges and opportunities for states in the 21st century. How states are going to respond to various global crises will shape their development and economic and geopolitical future, right? And we can see how states manage, probably the best example of this is the COVID-19 crisis, which is a global pandemic, a globalized crisis. But there are other global crises, including the global climate change crisis, et cetera, and how states are going to manage these crises are also going to impact their future, right? We discussed the predictions for growth and geopolitical power in coming decades. With projected outlooks like, Indonesia being the fourth largest economy by 2045, et cetera. But we cannot overlook the fact that many factors could impede such progress. For example, the economic crisis that hit Japan in the 1990s was a huge setback for Japan. And Japan was projected in the 1980s to become a much more powerful state than China in the 21st century. However, we can see that did not happen. Japan's massive amounts of growth and development was impacted by this economic crisis. And then we can see other powers rising who were unexpected to rise at such a rate. So the organizations that are attached to these growing economies, such as the Shanghai Cooperation Agreement, which brings together China and India, the Association of Southeast Nation States, the African Union. These are all transnational organizations which seek to challenge the hegemony of the West within the global political economy and global governance, and will likely challenge the EU and NAFTA in the future, right? So there's more regionalization also happening around these newly developed powers as well. However, there are many hurdles to overcome if these states wish to surpass the dominance of the West, or what's sometimes referred to as the global North, within world order. And we mentioned some of the very severe structural issues that these states face. That being said, many of these countries that are within the global North or the West or the economic hegemonic states within the contemporary world order, they're also facing a series of challenges they're not entirely unlike the ones that these developing nations are facing as well. And we discussed that in previous weeks when we discussed things like Brexit and the different crises that they're happening within what's called sometimes the transatlantic order, like I mentioned. We, of course, also didn't discuss the other growing economic powers because we're just constrained by time. But we could also have talked about Argentina, Nigeria, South Africa, Bolivia, and these could also be places where we see growing economic powers in future years. So as you come out of this program, it is our hope that you become successful in global business and are able to identify the opportunities and navigate political risks within a transforming international environment. One that is going to be characterized much more likely by multipolarity, many different poles throughout the world, rather than unipolarity of just Western dominance over world order. So we could have a world order made up of various different superpowers rather than kind of dominated by the historic great powers, which will be a very interesting environment and will be one in which it'll be a huge asset to be able to navigate, have this basic comprehension understanding of these different states. So just a few things to think about. Who will dominate world trade by 2040? How will traditional powers react to this? How have they already reacted if you look at the rise of China and India, et cetera? What needs to happen to make sure that more countries benefit from trade and development? These are all big questions that that economists everywhere are struggling with and seeking to decipher. So I'm putting it on you to take these questions and think about them, and hopefully this knowledge will benefit you in your future endeavors as well. We will end here for today, but I look forward to reading your G20 assignments. I also look forward to them all being very different from one another and not sharing sources and using different countries. So if you are in fear that you've been exchanging notes and sharing information and going to do the same country as another student, that is completely unacceptable for this assignment. And if I see similar sources and countries used on multiple assignments, I will be docking grades or even perhaps bring it to the program director, because this is not working independently. It has been a struggle in previous assignments. I haven't brought anyone up on it yet, but I have been informed that this is not the expectation of the course. So just be sure that you're working completely independently. You're not sharing sources. I should not see same sources. If you're doing a country, like I mentioned, like France or China or Italy, I shouldn't see everyone, with so much information about each of these countries, I should not see same sources of information. And so if you are in fear that you're going to do this, I'd recommend switching your country and using one that hasn't been chosen or that your classmates are not using, because that this is an independent assignment. That being said, I wish you all luck, and please feel free to email me if you have any questions or concerns about the assignment. It should be quite straightforward as long as you answer the questions and cite appropriately, et cetera. You should be doing fine. But yeah, thank you all, and I look forward to reading them. See you next week. Bye-bye.